All right, level fours are questions that we're going to plot points on a coordinate plane and then figure out what shape is best described by different properties that we can find on the coordinate plane. So in level 4, it says E is at negative 4, 8. So I'm going to go ahead and plot all these points. Okay, so now that I've got all those points plotted, I'm going to connect my dots here. Okay, so just by looking at this, we can probably maybe tell that it's a parallelogram, but what type of parallelogram? Is it a rhombus or is it just a regular parallelogram? Is it a kite? I'm sorry, not a kite. Is it a rectangle or is it a square? So here's some things that I always start with. Something good to start with is the slope of every side. So let's go ahead and find the slope of HG and EF. So this is going to equal 0. And then the slope of EF. That will also equal 0. So since those have the same slopes, that means that EF is parallel to HG. So that's something that I do know. So at least one set is of opposite sides are parallel. So now I'm going to do that for the other two sides. EH. It's going to reduce to 4/3. Okay, so that's the slope of EH equals 4/3. Now let's go to the other side and see what happens. Because if it's not parallel, then it's not a parallelogram. It could be a trapezoid. And you should come out with 4/3 again. So the slope of FG is 4/3 and the slope of EH is 4/3, meaning that EH is parallel to FG. So because two sets of opposite sides are parallel, I at least know that this is a parallelogram. Now, if you look at your quad family tree, you've got a couple parallelograms going on. You could have then a rectangle or a rhombus. So let's distinguish between those two. The major difference between a rectangle and a rhombus is the fact that the rectangle has perpendicular lines. So the sides are perpendicular. If we look at our slopes or at our picture, yeah, it doesn't look like the lines are parallel, but we've got to show that mathematically the lines are in parallel, and how we do that is by looking at the slopes. Remember, if two lines are parallel, their slopes are going to be opposite reciprocals. But since EH equals 4/3, and the line that it intersects with is HG, and that equals 0, these two are not perpendicular because they're not opposite reciprocals. So this parallelogram is not a rectangle. Okay, not a rectangle. So we still have a parallelogram, and if it's not a rectangle, it can't be a square either because of that same reason. Okay, the sides aren't perpendicular. The last type of parallelogram that we have got to test out to see if it's a rhombus. So if you pick a description of a rhombus, one of those properties of the rhombus, and let's test that. What I usually do is, I think it's less work, but you can prove that the diagonals, well, if you prove that the diagonals aren't congruent, that's still a property of a parallelogram. That's not necessarily a property of a rhombus. Something else that you can prove is that all sides of a rhombus are equal. So you've got to do the distance formula 4 times in order to prove that. So if I go ahead and do that, I'm going to do that with EF. So I'll do -4 minus 6 squared plus 8 minus 8 squared. So this is going to be, that's going to be 0, so this is just going to come out to be 10. So EF is 10, so let's go ahead and go down to the bottom. Let's do HG. This is also actually going to be 10 as well. Okay, if you do -10 minus 0 squared and then square root it, whoops, it's going to be 10. So I know opposite sides are congruent. That's not necessarily a property of a rhombus, it's more of a property of a parallelogram. So let's see if the other sides are congruent as well. So if I do 8 minus 0 squared plus -4 minus -10 squared, I'll have 64 plus 36, which gives me the square root of 100, which equals 10. So this side is also 10. And then this side, if we do 8 minus 0, and talking about FG, so 8 minus 0 squared plus 6 minus 0 squared. This will also get us 10. So since all sides are equal, they're all 10, we can conclude that this is a rhombus. Okay, it's not just a regular parallelogram. Okay, so I always start with the slopes of each side and see if I can determine anything. If both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, that means it's some type of parallelogram. I just got to filter down that quad family tree. If two sides or only one set of sides are parallel, that means it's a trapezoid. And then from there, all I would try and prove to see if it's isosceles trapezoid to see if the legs are congruent. And then if no sides are parallel, that means it's a kite. But you've got to make sure that you prove something else, because otherwise it could just be a regular quadrilateral. It can't be any, special type. So always start with your slopes, and then I would go to the distance formula and prove a property there.